Welcome back, knowledge seekers. Today we are getting into the history of Reiki. There is kind of a lot to unpack here because you have the three main players, Dr. Mikao Usui, the founder of Reiki, Dr. Chujiro Hayashi, and then Mrs. Hawayo Takata, who brings Reiki to the United States. Now, in there as well, you will also have the foundation laid for modern Reiki, especially modern day Reiki here in the West. And what's interesting about that is I'd be really curious to see what practitioners who were trained in like the 60s, the 70s, maybe even the early 80s have to say, because it is acknowledged that Mrs. Takata gently changed some of the facts of Reiki and kind of changed how it was taught in comparison with Japan. And I feel like there are some reasons why she may have done that. We'll get into that later, but right now, let's kick off with the founder of Reiki, Dr. Mikao Usui. You will often also hear him referred to as Usui Sensei. I will point out right now in the beginning is that you will notice more often than not the three kind of founders or the three main people that we study in the history of Reiki, their first names are almost never used. And that is due to being an honorific. They are usually referred to as Dr. Usui or Usui Sensei, Dr. Hayashi, and Mrs. Takata. You will hear their first names used, kind of to introduce them, and then after that, it's just their last name. It's usually done out of respect and as an honorific. Dr. Usui was born August 15th, 1865, in the village of Tanai in the Yamagata district of Gifu Prefecture, which would be located near present-day Nagoya, Japan. And at a very young age, he would be started on his path to studying Buddhism. I do also want to note that at the time he was born, it was during the reign of the Meiji-I, or Meiji-I think it's Meiji-I Emperor. And that's from 1886 to 1912. And at this time, kind of like in comparison with China, Japan was now an open country. You had a lot of people coming in and out. They were traveling throughout different parts of Asia to like India, the United States, Europe, Canada. They were traveling around. And this is important to note. At the age of 4, Dr. Usui was sent to live with Tendai monks in order to study with them, where he would learn many things along as Kiko, which is the Japanese version of Qigong, which is a health and healing discipline that uses the life force energy. Now, on his tomb, it is said that he visited China, the United States, and Europe, and was fond of reading, acquiring knowledge of medicine, history, psychology, world religions, and fortune telling. Fortune telling was a big thing that was taught in Japan at this time. And one of the things that little Yasui learned or realized in his studies is that a lot of the current healing modalities that were available, especially energy healing ones, required the practitioner to build up their life force energy and then impart it on the person that they're healing, therefore kind of lowering their own life force energy and kind of taking them out of commission for a while. And to him, he kind of started to question if there was a better way to do this. Foreshadowing. So he goes on to have a very storied career. So he has official government jobs, he's a businessman, a journalist, and he's secretary to Shinpai Goto, who would then later go on to become mayor of Tokyo. Now, there is some speculation as to whether or not he was a Buddhist monk. In reality, he was a lay Buddhist monast missionary, because he would go into prisons and do work in prisons with them. And they think that's why people might have thought he was indeed a Buddhist monk. He is not. He was not. So, in his storied career, he would study various branches of Buddhism, including Zen, Shinto, Mahayana, and Shinran. And while he is often referred to as Dr. Usui, he never actually had a PhD or a medical degree. It is an honorific that has been bestowed upon him. Part of that might also be because Mrs. Takata actually said that he had graduated from a couple different universities abroad and here in the United States. When William Rand actually went to go do work for it, he found that that wasn't true. And it was in the 90s where you start to see people kind of really digging in to the history of Reiki, especially Usui Sensei and Dr. Hayashi, because they're trying to put the pieces together, wondering why Mrs. Takata's story doesn't add up. So that's where a lot of this stuff starts to get unearthed. Now, we don't know everything, and there's a reason for that. And that is because there is a cultural standard in Japan, or a cultural phenomenon. I don't know, that's not the right word either. But there's a cultural concept, there we go, where not everything is available to you if you are outside of the family or you are outside of the culture. Japan is still on some levels kind of a closed culture, which is fine. There is also this concept that you will come across in spiritual work where it is sacred knowledge and secret knowledge. Depending on the root language of the or depending on the root language of the discipline that you're working in, the two words can be interchangeable. And what it essentially means is that you are not going to readily get this information until you have sacrificed something of yourself in order to learn it. That's basic. By today's modern standards, it's time. You have to sacrifice your time at some point to put in the dedication in order to learn your craft and to hone your craft. It was probably the same thing back then, but there might have been different types of sacrifices that people could also make. Today, too, you pay for your classes, so time and money are really the big sacrifices that we make today. Anyway, back to Dr. Usui. So he was a highly educated man, self-educated man, and he's always on the hunt for a higher level of spirituality. So on the advice of some of his Buddhist teachers, he decides to undergo I'm going to pronounce this wrong. I know I have the phonetic somewhere. A shuguo, which is a strict spiritual kind of discipline slash you might want to almost like a pilgrimage or retreat or meditation might actually be the better words, because what he's going to do is he's going to go up to Mount Kumara or Mount Kurama, and spend 21 days there fasting. And what you do during this retreat is you stand under the waterfall and you let it fall on your crown chakra in hopes of opening up the crown. And that's what happens. On the 21st day, he says that a great Reiki entered him and he was filled with this light. And thus, symbols came to him, all of this knowledge came to him, and he discovered, or by some standards, rediscovered a new type of hands-on healing, or rediscovered an existing type of hands-on healing that had been forgotten. There are different ways of looking at it according to the Japanese culture. And I think even just some of the history that's written. So you can still actually do this kind of retreat or meditation today. Mount Kumara is, or Kumara? Kumara? I know I'm saying that wrong. There will be pictures and words somewhere here. I tried to look up some of this stuff. I did it the first time, but it was lost. Yes, this is the second time I'm filming this. Thought I was good the first time. Wasn't. Kind of questioning how this one's going to come out, but nevertheless, we carry on. So, but yeah, you can actually still go to this mountain and do this same meditation, retreat, pilgrimage, however you want to look at it, whatever you want to call it, that Dr. Usui did. This mountain is still available, is still open to people to do this. I believe there is actually a Buddhist temple or shrine that is there for pilgrims. So now that he has access to this new healing energy, Reiki, he wants to pass it on to others. And his enhanced healing, with his enhanced healing abilities and this new gift, he has the ability to heal others without depleting his own energy. So that observation he made as a child, he now has the answer to it. He can now heal people without taking himself out of commission. And this is a huge thing. So he will spend the next 7 years healing people in Kyoto. So while in Tokyo, Dr. Usui sets up a foundation, Healing and Teaching Foundation, which is this Usui Reiki Ryoho, or Usui Spiritual Energy Healing Method. during which time he passes on his knowledge to others so the teaching could continue. So originally, Usui used his healing method to treat his family, and he cured his wife from a serious disease. That was kind of when he realized just how invaluable and important his healing was. So it makes it sound like he went right into healing others. He didn't. I think he needed to fully appreciate how powerful and valuable what he had been given was. And then he starts on this process of healing people and training people, and becomes actually really well known as a great healer. So there are 3 levels of Reiki as Dr. Usui intended. The first one is Shoden, which is the entrance level Reiki, or Reiki level 1. And this is freely available to all people. At this time, 2,000 people received a Reiki level 1 attunement and learned it from him. And this was called Tate, also known as Tate, meaning a hands-on healing, and most would only achieve a level 1 Shoden. Level 2 was Okuden, meaning a drop inside, or this was the second degree. About 30 to 50 people learned this, and then approximately 20 people acquired the third level of Shinpuden. So this is mystery or secret teachings. Now, Reiki master has kind of 2 degrees, or maybe 3 if you want to look at it properly, because you can become a Reiki master and choose to not learn to teach others, or choose to put that off until you're ready to do so. So you're still a Reiki master, you just don't have students. Then there is the level of someone training to become a Reiki master who can take students. So the assistant level teacher is known as Shinhan, while the venerable teacher is known as Shihan. And venerable teacher is the person who not only is a Reiki master, but they can take and train students. The Shinhan is someone who is currently in training, because you do have to go through extra levels of training in order to teach someone else. We'll get to that another day, but had it in my notes and we're going over it now. This is actually kind of an important level, because Mrs. Takata will kind of follow the same thing, but you will notice that not a lot of people become Reiki masters under Mrs. Takata either, for different reasons. So there was no formal attunement process under Dr. Usui. You would just follow him around for a year. He would decide you were ready and then move you up to the next level. And as Reiki grew more popular, he actually had to formalize the attunement process. As we all know, in 1922, Dr. Usui opened his clinic in Tokyo and became an incredibly renowned healer. And he was known as restarting hands-on healing from past generations. Now, in 1923, there would be a massive earthquake in Kanto that would devastate Tokyo, where 140,000 people were killed. Over half of the houses and buildings were shaken down and burned. And there were an overwhelming number of people that were injured and needed help and healing. They were sick, they were grieving, and Usui Sensei went in and started doing the best he could to help heal people, and to bring in probably more of his students with him to also aid in the healing. And throughout this process, Reiki grew. And so with the growth of it, he opened another clinic in Nakano, Tokyo. And his reputation spread so that he started traveling throughout Japan to teach more people. And in his travels, he taught over 2,000 students, initiated 16 teachers. The Japanese government issued him the Kunsanto Award for doing honorable work to help others. And then he would pass while teaching in Fukuyama on March 9th, 1926, from a massive stroke. His grave is at Saihako Temple in Suganami, Tokyo, but it is believed that his ashes are elsewhere. So, in steps Dr. Chujiro Hayashi. Now, he was not Dr. Usui's successor. What's kind of funny is I think he actually served with the person that would succeed Dr. Usui in the Navy, because Dr. Hayashi is a Navy veteran. He is a Navy doctor, and he trained at the Japan Naval Academy, and that's where he would graduate from. He would go on to serve honorably in the Japanese Navy before, I guess, retiring and going on to learn Reiki under Dr. Usui. What Dr. Hayashi does is he actually starts writing up pamphlets and booklets with the hand signals, basically the hand placements. He helps to further kind of formalize Reiki, and he teaches a number of other people. He goes on to set up his own clinic in Tokyo, and he also changes and kind of formalizes the attunement process. It was he that refined the teaching of other Reiki masters, along with the Japanese American woman Hawayo Takata, who would bring Reiki to the United States. So he is Mrs. Takata's teacher. So I want you to make note, because he actually kept records, he kept manuals or printed materials, he let his students take note. Keep that in mind. So now we step into Mrs. Hawayo Takata. She is the person that brings Reiki to the United States. She is born December 24th, 1900 in Kauai, Hawaii, on a plantation where her parents worked the sugarcane plantations. She will actually go on to live there, grow up there, and marry the bookkeeper on the plantation. Her husband dies in 1930 at the age of 34, leaving her with two young daughters. So she does what any single mom does and steps up to take care of her family. However, in the process, she ruins her health. Now, somewhere along this way, her sister passes away, and her parents have moved back to Japan, more than likely for retirement. So she now needs to travel to Japan to notify her parents of her sister's passing, which she does. Once she does, she checks herself into a hospital in Japan. Now, from there, she is diagnosed with a tumor, gallstones, appendicitis, and asthma. She happens to go to one of Dr. Hayashi's clinics, where she is given an almost identical diagnosis. And she decides that what she is going to do is she's going to be treated by Dr. Hayashi. I don't know if it was like every day or like two or three times a week. She would go in for Reiki treatments for, I think, an hour or 2 hours. And within 4 months, she was cured. So she is now a believer. She loves Reiki, thinks it needs to be. She is determined to learn, and thus studies under Dr. Hayashi for a year. And in 1936, she gets her Reiki level 1 attunement. She studies with him for a year, and in 1937 gets her Reiki level 2, and then comes back to the United States. Now, some people say Dr. Hayashi was invited, or some sources say that. Other sources say he followed her with one of his daughters. Regardless, Dr. Hayashi comes to Hawaii and helps Mrs. Takata set up her clinics in Hawaii, and she has several of them, one of them being in Hilo on the big island of Hawaii. Now, she would give treatments and initiate students of Reiki up to level 2. As her reputation grew, she did start traveling into the mainland US to teach other people Reiki. And then now this is where Mrs. Takata kind of starts to change things, where Dr. Usui and even Dr. Hayashi had people work alongside him to learn Reiki level 1 and 2. Mrs. Takata sets up weekend workshops for Reiki level 1 and Reiki level 2, and it's usually taught within a weekend. So for the master level, you worked beside her for a year. She used the spiritual empowerment which Dr. Hayashi had taught her, which she called an initiation or attunement, to transfer healing ability. Now, in 1970, Mrs. Takata began initiating Reiki masters. However, there was a $10,000 fee in order to become a Reiki master. There is some speculation about why she did this. The biggest is that she wanted to instill a sense of respect for Reiki. However, I don't think the $10,000 master level charge had that effect. Like, it was probably more of a turnoff for a lot of people. So even though it was only taught in one weekend, it was $10,000 for one weekend. The fee was originally not part of the Usui system, but it was a way to initiate respect. So there is actually this kind of push-pull movement, and that's one of the things that is talked about when you learn Reiki, is that it's okay, but you shouldn't be doing it for free if you can help it. You can barter or you can get paid, but you shouldn't be doing it for free because you have taken the time to learn this. You've taken the time to hone your skill, put aside the weekends to do the work, do the hours of training the clients and whatnot in order to get your certifications. So there should be some give and take. You don't want to overcharge people, but you also should receive some kind of compensation for your work. So this is kind of where you start to see this kind of push-pull feeling among the healing community. And it still exists today. She felt people should not do treatments or provide training for free, but charge a fee to gain something in return or gain something in return through barter. She felt and taught someone should study with the same teacher and stay with them throughout their, time. And her students, here's the thing. Remember how I told you Dr. Hayashi wrote manuals? He formalized things. There were pamphlets. Mrs. Takata wouldn't let her students take notes. They had to memorize everything, and it was completely down to an oral tradition. No one knows why she did this. But they all had to memorize everything. It had to be, done by rote, repetition, and memory. You weren't allowed to bring any kind of writing materials. You weren't allowed to take tape recorders. You just weren't allowed to do any kind of recording. It all had to be by memory. And because that's not how it was done in Japan, clearly, since I was telling you that, people were allowed to take notes and there were pamphlets written, handed out. She made students take an oath to teach as she had taught them, which made it really difficult for her students to teach other students. And after the death of Dr. Hayashi, she tells people she is the only Reiki master left and encourages people not to study and not to look into the history of Reiki. So this was partly accomplished due to the language barrier. She would die in 1980. Now, in the mid-1980s, Iris Ishikura, one of Mrs. Takata's master students, began charging a far more reasonable fee for the master level training. Masters trained by Ishikura at the lower fee began training other masters. So now all of a sudden, because it's a lot cheaper and because it's more available, you have more people willing to learn, and it spreads farther and it fosters deeper respect than the $10,000 fee that Mrs. Takata offered. Imposed. Many were open to the changes, allowing the wisdom of the energy to guide them in the way they should practice and teach Reiki. In time, people came to respect Reiki more as classes were cheaper, more available, workbooks were written, and studied with other masters. So that was like, I myself have 2 Reiki teachers, and I study with a third that I have done Reiki share with. I would study with her for other things. So yeah, it's interesting because you do learn different things because different people have acquired different skills in their practice, or they have different approaches. The other thing is this is something that will come up in another video, is you have non-psychic teachers. So you have board just general teachers, and then you also have a large number of psychic teachers. So not everyone that does Reiki can channel the spiritual elements, and then you have people that can. You have people that are strictly medical based and people that are more spiritual based. So you kind of have started to see this kind of branching out and wider community where you have a wider variety of people, and you can study with who resonates best with you. After Mrs. Takata's death, there was a discussion on who would become the next Grand Master. And there were 2 front runners, her granddaughter, Phyllis Lee Furumoto, or Dr. Barbara Weber Ray. Furumoto was chosen for agreeing to follow in her grandmother's footsteps. Dr. Weber Ray, try saying that 3 times fast. Dr. Weber Ray broke away to found her own Reiki called the Radiance Technique, which was later referred to or changed to Real Reiki. Then in 1982, you have the Western Reiki's Masters meetings to discuss the differences on how everyone was taught because it was an oral tradition. So some people learned things a little bit differently, or sometimes the wires got crossed and the information was different. So they were able to standardize some things, and these have had major influences on how Reiki is taught today. And it is called the Western tradition of Usui Reiki. And there was agreement on how to teach the symbols, how to form the symbols. What's ironic is that I can remember my first Reiki class being told you do not share these symbols with anyone who doesn't practice Reiki. I was very confused when I found books and there are the symbols, and I'm like, aren't we not supposed to share these? Like, especially the three main symbols are out there. They're in the wild. I haven't looked for some of the upper level ones. I'm afraid to. It's one of those cases where ignorance is bliss. But yeah, realistically, you can't use them unless you've been attuned to the energy. Otherwise, they're just a bunch of squiggles. But to me, I'm just like, wait, it still miffs me a little bit that they're out there in the wild, but there's nothing I can do about it. In 1983, in British Columbia, the Reiki Alliance was formed, recognizing Phyllis Furumoto was the Grand Master who was entitled to train other masters. And then in 1988, Furumoto agreed that anyone could train a master. So apparently there was some discussion on that only you could be trained as a master student by the Grand Master. Then it was like no anyone could train anyone to be a Reiki master. And then in 1990, you have more masters and people moved away from the agreed upon system. Manuals were written, hand positions were added, shortened for training. And there are now 30 different types of Reiki that have been developed since Mrs. Takata's passing. Some closely follow her tradition, others do not. So, now here we're going to go back to why I said Mrs. Takata might have intentionally changed some of the information about Reiki. So Buddhism will come to the United States with the first Chinese immigrants. In 1853, in San Francisco, California, the first Buddhist temple will be built. And I believe Buddhism basically stays kind of clustered on the West Coast for a while. It probably did start to migrate east. To what degree? I would probably say with the 1960s, there was probably a big push eastward, or a big push across the country for like Hinduism and Buddhism, where a lot of those religions kind of tended to pick up. So you have Buddhism comes to the United States in 1853. Then in 1937, Japan will invade China, and they will stay in China until 1945. This is what will kick off as the Second Sino-Japanese War will eventually turn into what we know as the Pacific Theater of World War II. And if you notice, Mrs. Takata and Dr. Hayashi left Japan to come back to America in that same year. So if you know anything about your World War II history, in Germany, you know a lot of Germans started to trickle out, especially a lot of the German Jewish community started trying to get out of Dodge, basically, because they could see the writing on the wall and they were trying to escape to come to, whether it was America, probably England, Switzerland, wherever they could go where they knew they would be safe. I'm kind of wondering, I've never seen anything written, and I don't know if Japan had that same exodus. But I would be curious to see the records of Japanese immigrants starting around this period. If you have a lot of people that start trickling out of Japan to other places for the sake of safety, because or if it was a lot of Japanese Americans that may have started trickling back to Hawaii, to California, even Washington and Oregon at that time, so that they wouldn't get drafted by the Japanese government, either to end up drafted by the US government or end up in internment camps here in America. Now, I don't know how true this is, although statistically speaking, it kind of makes sense when you consider the fact that most of Japan is Buddhist. It was said that, now I did a quick and dirty search on this. I didn't do a really deep dive into it. I didn't go into full historian mode, because if I did, you would never get another video. But it was said that a lot of the Japanese in the internment camps here in the United States were actually Buddhist. Now, were there probably, I would assume there were probably also some Christian Japanese in there as well. What the proportion was is hard to say, because again, I just did a quick search. But history doesn't occur in a vacuum. So Mrs. Takata is probably watching all of this happen, especially after Pearl Harbor is bombed on December 7th, 1941. So you have all of these things going on in the Japanese American community. It doesn't say when she actually comes to the mainland to start teaching. If I'm so and World War II, especially the Pacific Theater, will go on up until September 2nd, 1945, when Japan surrenders. So you have all of this going on. It kind of makes sense because she starts to say that Dr. Usui was not a Buddhist, he was a Christian minister, or he was a Christian missionary. And she also goes on to say that he was well educated. He traveled, I think it was like I want to say, was it like Dartmouth? Can't remember what university she said he graduated from. And there was something else. There were a few other things there to make him more appealing to an American audience. And considering the time frame in which she is operating and living, it makes a lot of sense that here she has this healing modality that is so valuable and has so much potential. However, the relationship with Japan and America, or Japanese Americans with their American counterparts, things are a little fraught and complicated. I think that's probably a gross understatement, but you see what I'm getting at. So it makes sense that she would start to change elements of the history because she doesn't want to see her beloved Reiki, the thing that has healed her and can probably heal so many others, completely decimated, outlawed, whatever, taken away because people are angry. I think that's the best way to look at it. People are angry, they're hurting, they're grieving, they're scared. And so she frames it in such a way that it softens some of that information. It's probably also why she told her students they are not allowed to research the history of Reiki, because she is probably afraid of what will be discovered and that people will see that it is truly a Japanese healing art and not that it is more the embodiment of Japan rather than this figment of Dr. Usui that she has created. And considering the fact that she died in the 1980s, grew up during the Great Depression, was during the Second World War, that mindset of not rocking the boat and maybe putting, like, if you I'm sure some of you either have grandparents or great grandparents that grew up during this time period, you'll notice that certain frames of mind still exist, especially with like that shortage mentality. Oh, what? Let me save this because I don't know when I'm going to need it. Oh, let me hold on to this because I don't know where we're going to get it again. Enjoy this because we don't know when we're going to get it again. Um, so I can see how sometimes that mentality would hang around. And I think she was afraid that if people started uncovering that, Dr. Usui was indeed a Buddhist, that he had not studied here in America, that he didn't graduate from the schools that she said he had graduated from, that he wasn't a Christian missionary but a Buddhist missionary, that it might lead to a backlash where Reiki would be, again, diminished. I think by the time, because William Rand says that he started looking into it, there were other Reiki masters or other Reiki students that were looking into this, kind of putting the pieces together, being like, why doesn't all this stuff line up? It was far enough away that none of us really cared about who it was, where it was from. the foundations of it, because enough time had passed that we could look at it with different eyes and not really be concerned and seeing the value of it for what it is. So when you read about it in books, it's always very politely glossed over. It's just simply said that she needed to make it more palatable for an American audience. When you look at the historical context, you start to understand why she felt that need. And here we are, what, 40, 50, or 80 years later. So 86 years later, if her first clinic was founded in 1938, still practicing Reiki, no one cares that, it has survived, it has grown, it has evolved, and it is probably one of the most popular energy healing modalities, or it definitely ranks up there as one of the most popular healing modalities. One of my friends actually made a joke that everybody's a Reiki master, but I feel like because we run in the circles, we meet a lot of them. But that's basically what it is that, history is not always as straightforward as you think. And that is definitely worth keeping in mind, because this history took kind of a windy road before you got all of it. And there is probably still more that we don't know and may never know. Also, Reiki is practiced differently in Japan than it is here in the United States or here in the West. So if you meet a Japanese practitioner or someone who is trained in Japan, it might be I don't know if it's completely different, but there might be noticeable differences between the way people have been trained and how they practice. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you enjoyed it, please hit the like and subscribe button, and I'll see you again, my friends, until we meet again. Bye.